Hey guys, this is going to be our review of Batman Caped Crusader. I know it's been a little bit since the show came out on the 1st. It's a little bit late, but I feel like we're gonna have a take on the show that I don't think you're going to find is super common. We absolutely love what the show wants to do with Batman as a character, actually evolve Batman, doing the stuff that I've done in my fan fictions and like fan imagining of Batman. It's actually starting to happen. The first time this happened was with the Batman movie.
Like in terms of the common media, a lot of the kind of comics they look at are kind of usually the same, like five. It was nice to see the Batman and a director who's like clearly read up on his stuff, like, referencing stuff like Ego, and even Robert Pattinson talked about like stuff like Batman Shaman. Another thing to preface is like we are artists ourselves, and not to put ourselves in the same league.
No, for sure not. I've never done 2D animation in my life.
Yeah, like, but ultimately, like, I mean, we do have kind of our own artistic preferences. And I guess in terms of writing Batman and criticizing it, we've done stuff like this before where we've sat down and kind of tried to think about our own iteration of him. So kind of criticisms might come across as like we're being too cynical, but they're really not.
It is a critique in a way that, like, to get this out of the way, we want a season 2. I want a season 2. There's aspects of this show that I need it to prove in a season 2. I'm withholding my praise because I care about this. I'm a practical person. I'm not just going to immediately praise something that came out. We're going to hold it to a high standard because Batman is such a popular character. It's an international character. It should have a lot of money behind it. It should have a lot of care behind it because Batman can be such a powerful character, especially for kids, which is the primary audience of this. It's such an important story to tell, and the way you tell it is going to change the way Batman is seen in the future. I mean, BTAS changed the way Batman was seen. Even in the movies, it has an influence. So we're holding the same standard to this show. With that said, we love the show. Okay, so don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't get on our asses. The show is a bit of a period piece, or at least that's kind of how it was stated in the press. But if you watch the show, there's no real reference that I could find, at least, to kind of it being definitively in the 1940s. But that is absolutely the kind of aesthetic that they've gone with kind of this minimalist kind of art style to kind of complement the animation to kind of keep it steady and consistent.
Yeah, so I think the style is definitely a product of its budget. Some shots are more minimalist than others, but overall, I think they've used that to their advantage in many senses, where it is finally, again, going back to noir is something I like that the Batman did. So, noir and German Expressionism has these very harsh, contrasting colors and values, and so that ends up being very minimalist in a way, and so they can kind of fit it in. So the budget restriction is convenient for the style. At the same time, it's not perfect. There's certain shots in the show that have tons of details, tons of things to look at, and then there's other shots that are very empty. At the same time, again, we're holding this to a crazy standard that a lot of shows at this time, because you can't push animators to the limits anymore, like the 80s, like Disney did, 2D animation it's dying, unfortunately, just because it's such a hard medium. It's one of the hardest art forms there is. It is completely serviceable. It does what it needs to do. There is at no point where it's like unclear what's happening, but it definitely has its issues. I think what we should go into, which is a very positive take we have, are the character designs. So when it comes to Batman's design, it's very, very good. It hits perfectly. I know Harry is a huge fan of those first appearance ears, and
Oh yeah.
I'm usually not into them, but I loved them here. They worked perfectly.
Yeah, I think he looks fantastic in this show, particularly Batman. I think the one takeaway I kind of have is just that I kind of wish he had purple gloves, but that's just a bias in me from having read like some of the Golden Age stuff. But even that look kind of didn't really stick around for too long. But I just love the purple gloves, and I love the kind of devil horns kind of look to him. And I think there's enough about him that makes him look kind of not exactly like that version, not exactly like how Bruce Timm has done him before. There's a charm to this iteration of him and the way that he looks.
Yep, I agree. I think the Batman is, I mean, there's stuff you could add to it that could make it even cooler, but I think by itself, it's iconic. It works.
5 George Clooney's out of 5.
Yeah, five George Clooney's had a yeah. When it comes to the other characters, and I should we would the main villains of these episodes be a spoiler?
I wouldn't think so. They showed all of them in the trailer.
There's quite a few characters. I'm most impressed by not actually the villains, but a lot of just the regular characters. When it comes to just regular human characters in 2D animation, because everything's minimalist, you have to give them a very unique silhouette. That's actually one of the core animation principles. Every single human character, Harleen Quinzel, Renee Montoya, Catwoman when she's not Catwoman, Gordon, Bullock, yeah, all these human characters that don't have like a crazy costume, they are all recognizable. Like one of my favorite designs has to be Harleen Quinzel for sure.
As in her human interpretation or in her
I
outfit?
think both. We'll get into specifics of the issues with her episode, but from a simple design standpoint, both of her designs are incredible. I've heard that some people don't like her costume, but I personally love this new gold and green aesthetic. I think it's
I love it, yeah.
amazing.
I think it keeps in line with kind of the gesture roots, and ultimately that was kind of the influence for her. You look at that, and it's still Harley Quinn, and I love the kind of how would you say it? What's the thing kind of around her neck? The kind of thing that they gave Pennywise a couple years ago in It.
I don't even know what that's called.
Yeah, I don't know what it's called either, but it's cool. Like I really like it.
I like that they're changing things. Like a common theme you're gonna find in this review is that we like that they're changing this stuff. We like evolving Batman. Batman is over 50 years. How old is Batman now? Like
Like
70?
he's pushing 90, man.
He's pushing like 90 years old, guys. Like things gotta change. Harley Quinn's has 2 seasons of her own show. Like I think it's okay, guys. Like we can do this.
What'd you think of the Clayface design?
So Clayface is interesting. I did really, really like Clayface's design. I was skeptical because I think if you watch my the Batman criticism video, despite loving that movie, I had a lot of issues with how it's trying to be too realistic, and this show is not trying to be super realistic. It's trying to be more realistic than BTAS for sure. But Clayface is the more realistic, earlier interpretation of Clayface, which I did not want them to do in the Batman 2. But here, I think it works.
Yeah, and I think his look definitely complements the rest of the aesthetic. And I also just want to say that there's definitely an influence from a character called the Shadow, which was actually one of the influences for Batman in the first place. So I think that's also pretty cool. Like, I mean, he's got the red scarf, he's got the hat. Like that episode, I think is fantastic because there's a lot of references in it to other movies. The original Clayface from the comic books was based off of an actual 1940s actor whose name unfortunately escapes me. But like, I think all of that is present. And even if you prefer the kind of other Clayface, it's not like this version of him isn't there. He still serves his purpose as Clayface.
I only want to talk about two more characters. The next character I want to talk about is Catwoman. Her design is perfect.
Yeah, no, she is absolutely. I mean, there's not too much different than how she looked before, and like, I mean, I guess there's similarities between her and the Brave and the Bold show. But like, I mean, I always love that design. I love the colors of it. I just really love it, man. Like, there's nothing else really to say about it. I think you nailed it there.
Okay, the last character I want to talk about, there's multiple characters in this show, but we don't want to talk about each
Yeah.
one. That could be its own video or something. But I loved these episodes, but I'm not totally sold on the Two-Face design. I liked that it really did feel like there was holes in this guy's face, but I wish it was colored a different color on that side of his face.
Yeah. You know, when skin is deformed in that way, when skin is damaged, the color does kind of change.
For sure, it's not gonna look normal, and it's like it should have been like they could have picked anything. Could have gone with the red, the Dark Knight red. They could have gone with the purple. They could have gone with the green.
Yeah.
They could have done any color, and they just chose to do skin color, and it just looks weird.
It's too smooth. His face, like, I mean, you know, you can't put holes in his face and then have it be the same color, I think. But I do, there is an appreciation for it that I have because I think it kind of, and I could be completely misinformed on this, like, I'm not educated on the golden age of cinema, but I kind of like it because I think it kind of looks like what Two-Face would have looked like in kind of the early like 1930s to 1940s kind of movies. Like the kind of bad kind of makeup that's kind of weird looking. But as you kind of said there, I just think there could have been a bit more of a distinguishing factor between the two sides opposed to just the fact that one of them has holes in it. Like, bro, just get a stapler. Like, there's also the point to note that it's on the other side, which does have a hand in the character, but we can't talk about that yet.
Okay, so getting outside of the character designs, quality wise, the show is great. There is an issue that people have with the show, which I'm like already seeing. I already see like a thumbnail. New Batman goes woke in all capitals.
Yeah. Already out there.
Okay, if you're coming here and you're a fan of me, or you just happen to stumble across this video, just want to watch a review, and you're a consumer of like the challenging, the woke Hollywood stuff that many of these channels, there's so many channels, I couldn't list all of them. Channels that are exposing the cultural appropriation or whatever of shows and how they're too feminist or whatever, please just listen to me for a second. This is a business. These channels that have propped up, and this has been a thing since 2016, is become really profitable to have a negative take on every single thing that comes out. And it's really easy to call anything woke. And again, this show is just another punching bag that they can look at. I mean, it was Star Wars, it was the Marvel movies. They can make content about any show. They can find anything they want to find about it and criticize the cultural elements of the show. And as we've established, and correct me if I'm wrong, and like legitimately link me a source to a screenshot in the show where it says it's actually in the 40s. I know that the producer, I think Bruce Timm has probably said, hey, this is like based off the 40s or whatever. That's the main reference material, but that doesn't mean it takes place in the 40s. There's certain aspects of this show that make it immediately obvious that this isn't our world. This is a made up universe.
Like there's a place for those kinds of stories if that's what you're looking for. But unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people are looking for the accuracy of these things.
I do not think it's about historical accuracy. It's a common myth that these channels like to bring about. And really be honest with yourself, person watching this video. Is it really about the historical accuracy? Because consistently, the historical accuracy is used as an excuse for the criticism. I mean, they're doing it with the Assassin's Creed game that has a new black samurai, which was an actual person, by the way. So even when it is historically accurate, there's still a problem, but you can't outright say what your problem with it is. There is a lesbian couple in this show. Like, I mean, they're not a couple, but there's a date. And then there are, I guess, certain types of character. Like, there's an Asian woman. There's black people. There's a I don't even like to call it a gender swap, but yeah, there's a gender swap in the show. And look, I get it. If you come from the woke, anti-woke sphere where this is a common talking point, usually you have to really look for these types of things and really go in deep to find what's woke about it. This show, it's really easy to find. I mean, it's just Asian character, it's woke. Black characters, it's woke. Gender swapping or race swapping, it's woke. But from my perspective, who I used to follow these channels, I used to believe in this stuff, and I've grown out of it. At some point, you realize that this stuff is superficial, it's limiting, it's dumb. You need to at some point admit that you're just uncomfortable. It's okay. It is okay to admit that you have some kind of bias, that things can make you uncomfortable because we've grown up in that environment. We've literally learned to become uncomfortable with these things. You need to realize that yourself, because if you keep trying to find excuses to like historical accuracy to excuse yourself for being uncomfortable, that's a you problem. These types of people, Asian people, black people, lesbians, they exist in real life. I think there are circumstances in which it feels forced when they're trying to be progressive in a movie, trying to put characters in that are specifically there to be progressive. And I feel like that's where it can be a little bit obvious, and that's where a critique would be important. But that doesn't excuse whatever phobia that is attached to that thing. You can criticize the Miss Marvel movie or whatever, which I thought was really boring. You can criticize that for its representation and how it might be doing representation wrong. But if your outlook is that representation as a concept is wrong, you need to look inward, because that's not the problem.
That whole thing right there. 10 billion George Clooney's out of fucking 10 billion George Clooney's. People who don't like the date are dumb because it is not a new thing. Renee Montoya is a lesbian character. So is Harley Quinn. Like,
Harley Quinn has had bi energy like for the longest time. Her and like Poison Ivy have had bi energy for the longest time. She literally has a show in which she is like bisexual. Like it's only weird if you are conditioned to think it's weird. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this.
we got to chill. But also, ultimately, happy because now we can clickbait the fuck out of the title
That's
and
true.
get all the rage baiters in the comments. Anyway,
Batman woke question mark? Okay, I actually want to get into the last section that is spoiler free. I think Harry is way more qualified because he's such a massive fan of Batman the Animated Series, which started
indeed.
in 1992, I believe. So, what is the legacy of the animated series? And I've heard people say that this show is in its shadow. How do we feel about that?
Well, okay, look, I think when you get creatives on board like Bruce Timm, of course, that comparison is going to be raised, right? And in terms of what the legacy of the animated series is, you have to kind of recall what the character was then. People were in open arms about things like Batman 89, because at the time the character in comic books was very different and was not kind of being represented in the same way that he would be now. Batman the Animated Series opened an avenue for the character where certain things were explored and then set in stone. Things like Mr. Freeze's origin, Heart of Ice, like that is still for most people and even in the canon of the books, or at least was at one point, that is now what they've done with the character. It's about because ultimately the show being a Saturday morning cartoon, it's it was for children, and because of that, there was obviously lessons, were mandated to be taught to them. And so things about kind of sympathizing with your enemy, helping your enemy, and there's a representation of the character in it, in Batman the Animated Series, of this man who is kind of completely crippled by his humanity and by his care for the people he takes down each night. Of course, there are some exemptions from this, like the Joker, and every episode is written by a different person. And when we kind of cross over into the New Adventures of Batman, which was season four, Batman kind of becomes a bit more colder and kind of a bit more like how he's been seen in the mainstream, where he's significantly more intelligent and he's more distant. But if you look back kind of in the original series, Batman is a man who really struggles with his sympathy, his compassion for the people he takes down, and also with the question of how well he's actually doing. Batman is a very humanized character in that show, and I think that's what made him so kind of wonderful to watch in that early series because you could really relate to the weight that was on his shoulders, especially as a child. It gave him a definitive kind of idea for what it is he's going after. To have Batman 89, where we have a character who murders people, and then to have Batman the Animated Series, where he's kind of doing the exact opposite, that is kind of what has set the character in the direction that he has gone on since, that people have now kind of started to question as a result of. And I think that kind of leans into what Cape Crusaders is. And I think to say that the show stands in the shadow, or that Cape Crusader stands in the shadow of the animated series, I wouldn't agree that that's accurate because I think that people are trying to hold the animated series and this show and trying to put them up against each other when I don't think that was ever the intention. This show is not trying to replicate Batman the Animated Series. Absolutely not. Is it trying to replicate it? Is it trying to maybe be the successor? I'd say so in some ways. But if you ask Bruce Timm about it, I reckon he would tell you that he's just trying to do something new, something refreshing for himself, and something that maybe some aspects he had ideas for years and years ago, but ultimately didn't get to do, and now that he gets to explore now. Batman the Animated Series, that character in that show is my fucking hero. I love that guy so much. But I am not above seeing the character in a new light or seeing the character kind of in a neutral perspective where I'm able to acknowledge the flaws within him. And I think that is kind of a struggle that a lot of people currently have. And it's also something that is being like kind of wagered against the character in recent years because he exists in such a morally gray area.
I think what this discussion is getting at is my view of the way things are written for this character and for many other characters. Properties like Batman are sometimes written inside of a box. Usually, the only way to interpret them in new ways is through maybe like the DC Dark label. I think that's what it's called. Or it's just stuff like that, or Elseworld stories. If you are a huge famous writer, you might be able to do that. If you are a huge famous director, you might be able to evolve the character. Or if you're involved with maybe a huge famous director like Mattson Tomlin was. My thing about the animated series, whenever a character is written in a new way, that does not mean that the previous version is obsolete. The reason that this interpretation of Batman matters is because we got the previous interpretation. The art form evolves, it builds off of itself. Batman stories write themselves because of the conflict, not only in the world of Gotham, but because of the conflict outside of it. Writers have different opinions on Batman. Should Batman kill? Should he not kill? Is he too brutal? Is he a cop? Is all these things? Is he a rich billionaire? Is that a problem? That's great writing material. It writes itself. It's so good. The fact that we have these debates, the fact that the theming is so intense that we're literally arguing about it in real life means that there's something really good there to write about. Unfortunately, it feels like a lot of this stuff is only discussions we have in real life. And I'm really looking forward, and this is why I value the Batman and why I value this show. I'm looking forward to the fact that now these discussions are actually making it into the writing. It doesn't mean that Batman the animated series, that Batman is a very altruistic person. It doesn't mean that that's an invalid version of the character, that there's nothing to take away from that character. It means that we've seen it, we've learned our lesson from it, now we need to explore new avenues. Every failing or unique characteristic of a previous interpretation is an opportunity for a new interpretation. It's a constantly evolving thing. That's why I really like superheroes. I think deep down inside, a lot of us have this deep connection to a certain version of Batman. I think for me, it was the Arkham games. Because as a child, when you experience emotional stories as a child, they're like multiplied. There's a nostalgic element to it. When you play Arkham Asylum, it feels so deep. It feels so emotional. It feels so nostalgic and atmospheric. And you're going to keep on to that. And you're going to convince yourself that that's actually what it is factually. That it truly is that. And that it's designed to be that. What I've realized as I've grown up, you start to realize that the things you liked as a child, which is something everyone does, everyone's going to think that their childhood story is way more important than it actually is. Just because it's in your head doesn't mean it's a waste of time. It's a story in of itself. It's just a story you've made for yourself, which is great. And I think that's actually going to happen with this show when kids watch it. It's a natural process. But in 20 years, when kids come back to this show, they're going to need to look at it from a more unbiased, uncritical lens and look at it from what it really is, not from what they want it to be.
And I think there's something to say about just comic book characters in general, where I think this the same thing that we are currently saying about Batman, I think it's the same thing that you can say about Spider-Man or any character in comic books, because ultimately they are all a product of art, and art is totally subjective. The iterations that we are exposed to of these characters and of these people, because a lot of the time they kind of are people to us, especially like for me, like Batman for a long time in my mind like felt about as real as a person. But when it gets down to it, these characters, they exist in a bubble where everyone gets to have their own subjective conclusion as to what they are. And when art of them is delivered out into the world, it is up to you to decide what you feel about them. And you can't be right or wrong about it. And I think that's something I really appreciate about Cape Crusaders, because it doesn't give you a biased perspective of anybody. It gives you a pretty neutral perspective as the story plays out that leaves you with the ability to make your own perception of it. And I think that is a more important point to take away than what was done in BTAS a lot of the time, where it insists that this character is a hero. And not that there's anything wrong with that. As stated previously, I love BTAS. He's, like, as I said already, that version of the character is and was my hero. But ultimately, in the grand scheme of it, I understand that subjectivity is often what molds these characters. Each writer has a different way of doing it. Each writer has a different way of seeing him, and a lot of the time, some writers don't even like him. In this one, they're not trying to make you dislike him necessarily, but they're not trying to hide his flaws from you either. And I think people who are being very offended by the characterization of him in this show aren't understanding that
This guy
you,
isn't real.
yeah, he's not real and you can still love him. Like, yeah, people are fucking flawed and Batman is absolutely flawed and we have characters in other mediums that just people adore but would absolutely despise in real life.
If you watch Breaking Bad, it's not like Breaking Bad has existed since your childhood. It's a new show. It's an isolated show. This isn't a comic book character. This is a independent story. You come at it from an unbiased standpoint and look at it from a very clear standpoint of like, I really sympathize with this character. I like the depth of Walter White. He's obviously a terrible person, but the show finds a way to find the humanity in this person, explain why they do the things they do, and can make you question if you do the same things in their position. I think the same thing could be done for Batman. Batman is a very powerful figure, and I feel like you're wasting so much time telling stories that aren't really going to change people. I really value stories that are going to push the medium or are going to make people rethink something. It's actually going to give them not just a moral lesson, but challenge them in some way. And if you have a character who isn't complex, the moral lesson isn't going to be as foundational. I personally really like when Batman isn't a perfect person because I'm not a perfect person. Even though Batman isn't this perfect person in the show, which to give an example, I don't want to spoil it too much, but his treatment towards Alfred isn't pure like it is in the animated series. You can tell, and it's very subtle. This is a Bruce Wayne that has really been molded by his environment. He's been molded by being wealthy. He sees certain people in a very biased way, like Alfred, in a way that might be unsettling to you, but it's obvious that he's influenced by his environment. It's more realistic in that way. And from that, you get a redemption.
Yeah.
That's super important. It's character growth, it's realistic. In this case, Batman is really tearing down one of his closest friends. It's probably his closest friend he's ever going to have. And it's something that he needs to learn from, realize, even if that's slow, it's a slow process, that he's going to eventually grow from and become a better person. And that's such a powerful message, I think. It's such a powerful realization that moral changes don't happen with the snap of the fingers.
And they especially don't happen to somebody who's been in the shoes of a character like Bruce Wayne. And like I mean, I think ultimately with a character that is like Bruce Wayne who's presented in this, a lot of people like they kind of look at it and they don't appreciate the treatment of Alfred. But it's not like this version of Bruce Wayne is inept to change. We see throughout the course of the show that he does have sympathy, that he does have these things that maybe he isn't very well in touch with. But over the course of time, we get to see that he is listening and that he is going to develop as a person. I'm not necessarily going to say that the characterization for him is absolutely perfect.
I don't think it went for I don't think it went far enough actually.
Absolutely not. I don't think it did. But I think the one weakness that the show definitely has is just that it doesn't have enough of him in it a lot of the time. It doesn't have enough of him to kind of for us to really see that development, but they still put in the effort, and I think that's important to consider, especially considering the ramifications of what a situation like this would be like in real life. And I guess a lot of people would look at that as if it's taking it too seriously. But I think when you are coming at this character with new angles, and I also think with a character as important as he is to pop culture and to our lives, why shouldn't we
Why
treat him
shouldn't
with
he
the
be
same measure of
serious?
respect? Yeah, right? Because he's always been the ultra serious superhero. So why can't we give him the moral dilemmas of a real life person under his circumstances?
And I think people who if you are uncomfortable with the way Alfred is being treated in the show, that's the entire fucking point. You're
Yeah.
supposed to be uncomfortable. That's the show is literally like it is subtle. It's not telling you how to think, and I feel like people are uncomfortable with that. The show is purposely doing that. They want you to be like, "Damn, like Batman is kind of a piece of shit in this scene. Like, what the hell?" That's the point. Complex characters are complex because you have different views on them.
The show doesn't necessarily talk down to you, but in terms of representing our world, even though it is a period piece, I have to say, even though a lot of people aren't happy with the characterization of people like Harvey Bullock, I really like it because whether you like it or not, these things happen.
Harvey was actually a huge surprise, like one of the most complex characters in the show. I think we'll talk about it more in the spoiler section, but at first you might be quick to think that Harvey Dent is a flat character who is a reverse of what you'd usually see. But actually, like what he evolves into is way more complex than any of the other characters, and you actually start to sympathize with him.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of feel for him in that weird way. But it's also just a matter of like, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, people like this exist or have in our history anyway. Like there's an episode 4, which I think is one of the best episodes in the whole show because there's a big surprise at the end. There's a particular scene in which Flass and Bullock make a decision, and I just think that that singular moment, it also has so many consequences for the show going forward, but it also is a very, I'm not going to say realistic representation of cops, but I'm going to say it's a very realistic representation of corruption within the police force. Because from what I have researched and looked into from my own experience, things like this have happened in real life, not even just in the 40s, but as early as 20 years ago, as 5 years ago, shit like this continues to happen, and the fact that the show has enough of the balls to really kind of even comment on it, I think is fantastic. And also even with the politics of the show, with Harvey Dent, he has wronged the city by playing the game to get on top in the realm of authority.
Not everyone is corrupted by a single event. Everyone is corrupted by a long process. People don't just have opinions or have an outlook on life because this one thing happened. It's because that perspective has been normalized over and over and over again. That's why I really like Harvey Dent in this show, because he's slowly being corrupted and you know why he's doing it. You know why he's falling.
Yeah, and you can't really fault him either.
I think we're gonna wrap up this section, which might actually be its own video, honestly. We're gonna have a part two that we're immediately gonna record after this that will go more into the spoilers, and we'll probably go into more of our technical criticisms of the show, which specifically has to do with certain episodes in the show that we feel like really undermines the pacing of the entire season. So if
Yeah,
you want real spoiler talks where we're going in depth and not just about the general vibe of it, definitely click on that. It'll be probably on screen right now. But yeah, thank you for watching and look forward to that next video.
much appreciated, lads.